and welcome to the Momversation Club, the podcast born out of the idea that every mum needs a tribe. I'm Claire Strong.
And I'm Christina Schreckmeyer. We're two moms just like you, navigating the chaotic, challenging, and often isolating world of motherhood.
Now, it's said that it takes a village to raise a child, but we want to know, where the F is that village?
It's a question that resonates with so many of us who find ourselves raising children, managing careers, and trying to maintain our own identities, often with a sense of isolation.
Yeah, it can be really tough, but we're here to remind you that you're not alone. You don't have to do this by yourselves. The Momversation Club is your village, a place where you feel valued, appreciated, and understood.
We believe that by sharing our own experiences, successes, and struggles, that we can create a virtual village for all you amazing mamas out there.
So join us every week for a real, raw, and relatable discussion about all aspects of being a mum, including the things you just can't talk about to anyone else.
So if you've ever asked yourself where the F is the village, then you found your tribe. Let's get into it.
Hi, Christina.
Hey, Claire. How are you doing today?
I am doing good. How about you?
I'm doing good. I am really looking forward to today's episode. I've been thinking about this since we kind of started a podcast. And I just want to lay out, before we get into our today's topic, a little bit of a trigger warning to anyone who's listening. Today's episode is going to delve into some topics that might be a little triggering, things like childhood experiences that are involving in trauma, domestic violence, things like that. So if you're not in a space to receive that right now, go ahead and come back to us when you are and visit one of our other episodes. But today we are going to dive into some pretty serious topics that I think are going to be really impactful for a lot of people and help a lot of folks. So that is the trigger warning.
Okay, well, why don't you explain a little bit about what you're wanting to chat about today?
So today's episode is going to be talking a little bit about something that's been on my heart to share with our audience since the beginning, which is childhood trauma and how it affects your parenting. I don't often talk about it, but it's something that affects my parenting quite a bit. And I, have looked at stats about childhood trauma. And as I see how prevalent it is, I imagine there's a lot of listeners who also had childhood trauma growing up and have seen how it might be affecting their parenting now. So today's episode, I wanted to talk a little bit about what that trauma can look like and how it can lead into certain ways that you are in parenting and in motherhood, and what triggers might come up and how I navigate them. That being said, I'm not a doctor nor a therapist. So if you're someone who's struggling with this, definitely there are resources out there, and we will share a lot in our show notes. But this is just my experience and kind of what I wanted to talk about. So one of the first things I want to talk about is something called adverse childhood experiences. It's ACEs for short. And I was sharing a little bit with Claire. Claire, have you heard of this terminology before?
I haven't heard of it referred to exactly like that. So tell me a bit about it.
So this is something that I actually picked up on when I was working in the nonprofit realm, but essentially it can be divided into 3 different categories. And this is things that you might incur as a child growing up in a home under 18. You can divide it into abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. Abuse can be something like physical, emotional, sexual abuse. Neglect can look like physical neglect, emotional neglect. And household dysfunction is pretty broad, but things like mental illness, substance abuse, domestic violence, divorce, incarcerated family members, things like that. And so I heard an organization called First Five, and they're all over the United States, but they focus in on children 0 to 5 and how they develop and the best ways to get them the right things at the right time, because that 0 to 5 space is such a prominent spot for a child's development. And when you have someone who's experiencing those things, it can lead to a lot of different patterns as an adult, like later on as you kind of evolve from those roots. When there's actually a test called the ACEs test that we'll link to in the show notes, where you can take a test and it'll ask you yes or no questions about your upbringing in your household. and give you a score. And my score was 8, which is pretty high, because a lot of the things that were mentioned, minus maybe 2 or 3, are things that I dealt with as a child. And
So is
when
it, sorry, Christina, is it 8 out of 10 then? 10 being the most traumatic and
I think
severe?
it's 10. Yeah, I think
Right.
that it's 10 is like the max, but I could be wrong, and so it'll tell you on the test, but I know 8 is high. So,
Right.
and I knew that going in just because of everything. But the biggest thing that I didn't know about ACEs when I was, growing up, I didn't know this term at all. And then as an adult learning about it, is that it can cause something called toxic stress. So what that is when children are experiencing a stressor continuously, like over time, and they have no way of shutting off that stressor, it creates like this wear and tear like situation with you, because you're like revving this engine of a car over and over and over, and eventually like things start breaking down. And so toxic stress can affect the development of a child's brain. It can impact the way they learn, the way they relate to other people, their growth, all sorts of stuff. And when you look at those people who come out of those environments, there's kind of 2 paths that most people take. Either they'll go the exact opposite way, where like everything they seek out mentors, they seek out teachers to help them. They go excel in other spaces despite their trauma. And then there's other people that generational trauma leaks into their parenting decisions, the way they do life, their ability to not become alcoholics or substance abuse, users, or slip into domestic violence relationships. Those years are so vital. And, 0 to 18 really, but like 0 to 5 are huge. So that's just something I wanted our audience to be aware of, that if you experienced any hardships as a child, that you're not alone. There's a lot of people. It's actually 1 in 6 adults experience
Wow.
4 or more of those ACEs.
Gosh, that's a lot.
It's a lot.
And so today we're going to be focusing on how that impacts us as mums, because
Correct.
I mean, do you feel comfortable just sharing a bit about your story, Christina, and what that
Yeah.
looks like today, because you are a mum now of 2 girls?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'll share a little bit of my story, but obviously it's very layered. And I'm sure as we move on to different topics in our podcast, we'll talk more about some of this stuff. But, I've shared on here that my mom was very young when she had me, and she was 16, and she went on to have several children in a row, which caused, as a young mother, a lot of stress on her. And her environment that she grew up in wasn't ideal either. And so there was a lot of trauma that she had that she carried into her relationship as a mother and her children. And alongside that, she was also experiencing a lot of domestic abuse. My mom and my dad had kind of a rocky relationship with that, but there was a lot of back and forth with that. In between my mom and dad's, because they've been married, divorced, separated, married again, like they've had quite the situation. In between that, she had a lot of boyfriends, and these same patterns kept coming, like a lot of this domestic violence. And it was really hard to navigate as a child. I felt really unsafe a lot of times. I didn't know like what exactly was going on. Her emotions were all over the place, because hurt people tend to hurt people. And I was just a very young child, didn't know how to manage any of that. And also as the oldest, I felt very protective of my younger brothers and sisters. So I kind of took on a little bit of a parenting role as well there, just to kind of make sure that they were okay. Yeah. And so as far as like the ACEs and stuff, I mentioned like a lot of that stuff came into play, but it was quite traumatic. There was a lot of times where maybe we were staying in a women's shelter because we had lead away from a domestic violence partner. There were times where I saw domestic violence being implemented in my house, and I, as a child, called the police or hid from people, or, hid my sisters and brothers. And then, also alongside that, because my mother was a survivor of domestic abuse and she was dealing with all of this, she was also abusive towards us. So there was a lot of emotional and physical and verbal abuse coming towards us, to the point where one of the children actually was taken out of the home at one time. And it was really difficult. It was really difficult. And I also, it's layered because my mother, I had empathy for her growing up as like a young mom. So I felt like her co-parent because like she was, experiencing these things and I could see her hurting and I knew this is why as a young child, I could already like start reasoning and being like, this is why this behavior is happening and that behavior is happening. And I grew up really fast.
So, okay, first of all, have you been able to deal with that trauma? Because I guess that unless you're able to have therapy around that or come to a space where you're feeling okay, you're feeling, whole. I don't know whether that's the right word to use. How can you possibly, go and parent in a way that you would like to if you're carrying that? I guess what I'm trying to say. Christina.
Yeah. No, I think that it is a good question because how it affected me as a young adult and versus how it affects me as a mom are very different people, because when you become a mother, you shift and transform everything about you. You are so different after becoming a mom. And before I had children, I navigated this with a lot of anger. I was very closed off to people, very, guarded. There's a lot of, just protective nature about myself of making sure that never happened to me, wanting to be in relationships where I felt very much like I would never be in that situation with someone. And you can never predict that because domestic violence survivors know that like you often can't tell they're going to be abusive until you're in it. And so there was just a lot of distrust. Then when I became a parent, it shifted for me because I realized I started kind of looking at my daughter and seeing like this was me at some point. Like you start seeing yourself in your children.
Yes.
And it started feeling really raw in parenting, like starting to kind of like really envision the ages that you were when you remember certain things. And some of the scars that I thought I had healed in therapy started like coming out and being very close to the surface rather than like buried where I put them. And so, the impact of the abuse, I think, kind of came up more in parenting than it did when I was younger because I was able to push it down and be angry. And when you're a parent, you're kind of faced with little mini versions of yourself. And it not only with abuse, but with a lot of things about yourself, you see them in your kids.
That's true.
Yeah.
So how has that impacted your parenting? Give me an example. You just alluded to it then that, you were very angry before and now you've had to, you feel those scars coming to the surface because you've got children and you can see yourself in them. So what does that look like? Like what things do you kind of struggle with today that are a direct result of your upbringing?
Yeah. So one of the first obvious ones is things like hitting and screaming, kicking, normal tantrum, age appropriate, like toddler behaviors. Those were very difficult for me to navigate when I was first coming into parenthood, and they still are to this day. My first response when having like physical abuse come toward me is to shield myself and fight back. And that's just because I grew up in this environment where like, that's what you needed to protect yourself. And I was on this heightened alert, and having children that were, lack of predictability. You didn't know when they were going to tantrum or not. You didn't know if you were going to get like kicked in the face or not. Like I had a hard time with that. And I had to kind of like through therapy and also through just some self-talk be like, they are not trying to hurt you. They are having a hard time. Like I had to have this internal voice of like, your body feels like this person's coming at you to hurt you on purpose. But like in actuality, they're having a hard time. They don't have words. They're using their body to show how they're feeling. And I had to have those talks with myself because my first reaction as someone who's been abused is to hit back. And my worst fear is that I'll lose my temper and hit my child and be perpetrating that generational trauma onto my kids. So I work really hard to not bring that in, but it's something that comes up. And I think that because of the abuse statistics, there are probably a lot of parents who navigate those feelings of protecting yourself at the same time you want to hold your child. There's just so many emotions that come up when a child is hitting or kicking and screaming at you, something like coming toward you.
So what do you think has really helped you get to this point where you're able to you're able to remain calm and not to give into your instincts, which have, because of your experiences, have been to react, basically? Like, how have you come to that place?
It's really difficult. Like, I feel like I do really well when I have my self-care, when I'm able to have space, when I feel like that. I think one of the biggest tips I have is like, when you feel like you're coming up on that, I can only describe it as like, you know how like when your bathtub's filling and you get to that level where it's going to go over. Like, that's how I feel like when my children are hitting and kicking, is like, if the bathtub's rising and I start seeing it's going to go near the edge, I'm going to call an SOS and leave the room. Like, I need my partner to step in because I'm feeling at this place where I don't know if I can control my reactions, and I don't want to be in a situation like that. And there's been many times where I've had to do that, where I've had to, like, if we're out and about and my child throws a tantrum at the store, I get them to the car and shut the door, and just on the other side of the door, you know, making sure that they're not going to overheat or something, just deep breaths and trying to like refocus and recenter myself so that I don't scream and I don't try to hit and I don't do any of these behaviors that I don't want to do. That being said, it's not perfect. You know, life threw a child on the spectrum at me, which is very much like touching on all of the stuff that I deal with in my traumatic experience. And it's hard because they mirror each other a lot. You know, the lack of predictability with my daughter and how anything can be triggering, and she may have an outburst and she may have a meltdown, is very reminiscent of kind of being in an environment where anything can set off someone. And then at that point, you're no longer safe. And so you have to like repeat to yourself, like, you are safe. This is not that. You are okay. And like having those like thoughts to yourself. So to answer your question, like taking space, talking to yourself about the realities of what's actually happening versus what your mind is trying to tell you, because you're programmed to like be the certain way, and you're kind of going against your own programming when you're coming through a traumatic experience like that and going into really trying to heal and have it be where abuse stops here. Like, we aren't going to have this go in our family tree anymore. Like, this is where it stops.
It's really interesting and inspiring to hear you talk, because you've made a conscious decision of not choosing a partner that resembled the partners that your mum may have had in the past. And you've made a definite decision to stop, as you said, the abuse. The abuse is behind you. You're not going to repeat that generational trauma. But what would you say, Christina, to mums that may be listening to this and they may be actually living that situation right now? They may be in a situation that your mum was in, where their partners are, you know, abusive, whether it's physically, you know, emotionally, whatever. What would you say to them? Because it's a very difficult spot to be. I don't envy anyone in that situation, because it's hard enough being a mum, and then you're dealing with the abuse, and it's, you know, you're worn down, and it's terrible. So what would you say to someone listening who may be going through that right now?
You know, the first thing I would say is like, you know, it's okay that you feel like you want to stay in it. I think that there's this myth of like these women who are in these abusive situations, it's always bad. And then they, you know, get out, and it's not like that. Abuse is so nuanced when it comes to how you feel in a domestic violence situation. The people my mom was with, whether it's my dad, my stepdad, boyfriends, things like that, they weren't always monsters. There were moments of really great highs where they did really wonderful things and were so sweet to us, and like like kind of love bomby a little bit about like their affection. And then it would just swing right. And I think that for women who are in domestic violence situations or in abusive situations, they're just holding on to that other half of like when they are good, you know, they can be good. See, it's here. It's underneath all of this stuff. I have to dig it out sometimes, but it's here. And I just want to say to those women, like, the bad's there too. You know, even if they can be good, the bad still is there. And you have to look at how it affects you and your children, because your children are learning who to be from you. And I was so lucky to have people in my life who saw me early. There were my grandparents were huge in kind of steering me towards like, hey, there's this other path. Friends, like mom's friends of mine who had parents that like saw me and would invite me to dinners and things like that. Mentors, teachers who believe in you, things like that. But a lot of kids don't have that. And so they're learning how to be from you. And so navigating that and getting out is really important, and seeking out support from people who've done it before, women's shelters, things like that, in a safe way where you don't feel unsafe, like if you were to look it up. But I think also like looking inward, like I think a lot of people who are in these situations are healing from things in their childhood, and they're repeating paths and things that feel normal and routine. But if you really do some work on looking at what children's brains do and their development and how they're becoming a person, but especially those 0 to 5 years, when you know that information, you have to kind of, once you know the information, you have to do something with that information. And I just wish that when I think about myself as a younger child, I wish that my mom did have the strength to leave and then leave that path. She didn't. So it's my job to kind of not bring that to the next generation and the next generation. But that being said, my mother broke a lot of chains from her childhood. So like, just because you don't break all the chains doesn't mean some of the work that you did wasn't valid. So doing what you can to seek out a safe space. And yeah. But yeah, those triggers are real for parents. And like I mentioned before, like it can come out of nowhere too. Like you might think that you're just fine and you've healed from it, you've forgiven and everything's okay. But then your kid hits like a certain age or a certain stage, or something's happening in their lives, and it just brings it all back. I experienced that during my pregnancy with my daughter, Rennie. My daughter, Stella, was at an age where I remembered some pretty traumatic situations, and it came out of nowhere. Like she had just like had a birthday, and it reminded me of where I was at that age. And it was really hard to undo some of that work. And I had to work really hard with my therapist to kind of navigate that, because it was hard to look at her and see like little me.
So what was it that really triggered you?
I think just thinking about the expectations and the things that were put on me at that age, and then looking at my child and being like, I would never put that on you. I think one of the things is I have this really vivid memory. It was probably like 6 or 7. And I was in charge of loading the dishwasher. And my mom was going through a lot. There was a lot of like ups and downs with her relationships. She was dealing with some mental illness things that she was not medicated for. And she was going through a lot of highs and lows, where she would be on a really high manic high where she'd clean the whole house and it would be so fun. And she'd like pull us out of school and we'd go on Taco Bell runs. And like, she was fun mom. And then she'd have these dramatic drops, and she would be in her room all day and she wouldn't want to talk to anybody. She'd be snapping at us, and we would try to walk the line so that no one got hit or yelled at. And I remember being 6 or 7, which means that going in order of my brothers and sisters, my sister's 4, my youngest brother's 2, and then my younger brother isn't born yet. So like 6-year-old in charge of a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old while mom's sleeping, and to not wake her up. And so I was loading the dishwasher, trying to do it all right. My mom had woken up to make dinner and realized I hadn't loaded the dishwasher right. And she picked up the entirety of all the dishes and just threw them on the ground. And all the dishwasher stuff went everywhere. And then she just like said, clean it up, and walked out of the room. And so there's a lot of instances like that where it's like being hit for this, or not being taken to the hospital for certain things, or violence like that, where it's like, not, you didn't hit me, but there's like this level of control and fear that you would establish on me. And I think seeing Stella at that age and being like, how could you ever? And then having to navigate that as a parent and be like, you're not that. Like, you like shake it off. Like that is something we are healing from. We're going to mourn the loss of our childhood in that space. But these kids will never know that, and how wonderful that I get to kind of navigate that. And it's really, it's hard. It's hard to navigate. And you get those little flickers here and there. It's like school, certain things at school, or certain things that she's doing here, or, you know, the first time she was defiant to me where she slammed the door, like what would have happened to me if I had slammed a door? Like, there's just all these little moments where you're like, what the hell? Like, how could you ever? And it's hard to forgive people, but then also I have so much empathy for who she was in that moment. And that person no longer like is the person in front of me. Like, they're two different folks. So it's hard as a mom.
How is your relationship with your mom? How do you, especially when you get these triggers from flashbacks from your childhood that you know you are triggered by because of the stage that, you know, your kids are at, how does that impact how you relate to your mom now?
You know, it's difficult. I had to acknowledge that I may not get the answers and the response that I want and that I deserve. And it's hard at times because I'll bring things up and it feels very much like, don't bring up dirty laundry. Like, we've already moved past this. I've already said sorry. And sometimes when I bring things up, she'll say things like, I don't remember that. And what's hardest about that is the reason she doesn't remember that is because that's a normal Tuesday for her at that time. And it was very impactful for me. And so I've had to navigate, you know, talking to her in a way that guards my heart and saying things like, you may not remember that, but I definitely do. And, you know, that happened. Like, that did happen. And in fact happened. And, you know, it's like you want to hold her accountable for certain things, but also she is such a good grandma and such a different person now that she's medicated, now that she's in a situation where she's not in a fight or flight domestic violence situation. She's just different, and it's hard. And when I first had my daughter, I didn't feel comfortable with her watching her alone because I was worried about triggers that might come up if my daughter, you know, yelled or bit her or screamed. I actually like would pop in unannounced and like make sure she was being safe with her. But what I found is like, she's a very loving, caring grandma. She just wasn't that when I was younger. She wasn't the mom who she is now. Would have been wonderful to have had. And I mourn that. I wish that she had been healed, but yeah, it's difficult. It's a hard relationship to navigate with her because I forgive her for a lot of things, but I don't forget.
It's such a difficult situation, Christina, because the thing is, we, you know, our job is to protect our children. And, you know, when you've experienced that in your childhood, it's just like you say, I mean, you can't kind of wrap your head around, you know, why, even though that person may have been struggling at the time, why they would act in that way. But I'll just share a little bit about not my childhood, because my childhood, I was lucky to have a very stable childhood. There was no trauma there. But interestingly, my first marriage was not very stable. And so, you know, we mentioned earlier, or you mentioned earlier, that there's generally two paths that abused children will take. One is they want to be the exact opposite of everything that happened during their childhood. And then the other route, unfortunately, is just the, you know, probably the easier route, which is just to carry on the status quo because that's all you've known. And so I didn't have any of that going into my first marriage because I had a very stable upbringing, but my husband had an extremely unstable childhood, very toxic, a lot of abuse, you know, brought up by a single parent, and who was absent a lot of the time, you know, really, really toxic. And when I met him, he had decided that he wanted to put that behind him. He didn't want that life for himself. So I'm always a glass half full person. So I saw the potential and good in him. And so I wasn't overly concerned about his family and his upbringing because he'd to me, had expressed this strong desire not to ever want to go down that route. However, when life started getting tough, his business failed, we had financial issues. He reverted back to stuff that he had seen and experienced in childhood from a very young age, very toxic coping mechanisms, a lot of drugs, a lot of denial, no mental health help, no medication, using other stuff to medicate that wasn't safe. And so I had to leave that marriage for the sake of my kids, because I didn't want them being in a situation that he had been in for all of his life. And so I left that marriage for me, but also for my kids. And so you did mention it earlier about mums that are in abusive situations, and hey, listen, it doesn't, just to get this straight as well, abuse doesn't need to be physical.
No, it does not.
It doesn't need
and
to
a
be.
lot of it, I would say that to put a point on that,
Yeah.
a lot of people don't recognize abuse, because if it's not punching a wall or punching you, they don't see, like, for instance, narcissistic abuse or manipulation or all the other ways that people can be abusive.
So a bit like you, I didn't realize at the time necessarily how abusive the situation was until after I'd left. I was interviewing someone from a domestic abuse charity back in the UK. And I remember going into the office and they had a poster on the wall and it was saying all the different types of domestic abuse. And aside from the physical and sexual violence, I could tick off every single one of the other the other elements that would equate to domestic abuse. And so I would strongly say, like Christina, you've already mentioned, if you are in a situation that's abusive, and it doesn't mean that they're abusive 100% of the time, but if there are lots of toxic traits that keep manifesting themselves, and that this is going to adversely impact your kids, please just reach out and see what help is out there for you, because it's not worth staying to create another generation of trauma, which is going to create another generation of trauma, quite possibly.
Yeah. Well, and also I would say one of the hallmarks of an abusive person in a relationship is to isolate you. That's one of the first things they'll do, is isolate you from your friends and family. I would say find someone you trust and let them know what's happening. So that way you have one person who is able to look out for you and help you. I know in many situations with my mom, if we did not have a neighbor or a friend or somebody in our lives, we wouldn't have been able to get out of those situations. There was a lot of times in my life where the abuse got so bad that we had to just leave our items and leave the house with just a suitcase. And the stability, the lack of stability was really hard. But thank God she had someone trusted who could get us out of those situations and make sure we were safe, at least physically for the most part, So if you are feeling like you're starting to get isolated, keep a hand on somebody that you trust. And there are a lot of supportive resources out there for people in those situations. And it's not your fault that you're in those situations. They aren't like that all the time. They build a lot of charming qualities about themselves. They isolate you. There's this whole path. Another thing I'll say is if someone hits you, they're probably going to hit you again. And I've struggled with friendships in my life where their husband became physical and they were trying to walk it back. And it's this, that. It's no, there's no excuse for that. If they have the capacity to hit you, it's only a matter of what's the next trigger of when they're going to hit you again. And so for the sake of you and your safety, but also your children's, it's really, really important to get that help. And there's so many news clips right now that are circulating of these women who are in abusive situations where nobody knew. Nobody knew that was happening. And that's so often the case. And so if you see something kind of off, I wouldn't call it out, because that can make the person, it's my mom was kind of like a street cat, if you said, hey, what's going on with that bruise? She would get skittish and run. But cultivate a little bit of a friendship with that person. Like start kind of being involved and seeing how their life's going. They'll open up to you if they trust you.
Yeah, because I remember during my marriage, because I wasn't, throughout the years ready to leave, I didn't want to tell people what was going on, because then at the point when you put it out there, I think the pressure's on yourself then to actually do something about it. Well, you can't,
Exactly.
like the boy that cries wolf. Well, you've said it's bad, but you never leave, so it can't be that bad. And so I was kind of embarrassed. So I didn't tell anyone except for one person who I was my confidant during those years, until I found the strength to go. And then I was open about, why I left, to the people that it was, necessary or relevant to talk to. Another mum influencer who I think does a great job of this is The Diary of an Honest Mum. I don't know whether
Yes. Libby Ward.
Whether you our listeners, our viewers already follow her, but she clearly went through a lot, just like you, Christina, in childhood, and she's made it her mission really to parent in a very different style to how she was raised, and to not let her childhood trauma color her parenting. And so I would encourage our listeners to check her out too. But this is it's an exceptionally important topic that I'm so glad we've covered today, and this will not be the last time we do this. This is the first of many episodes dedicated to this, and all the different nuances and all the very many facets that makes up an abusive relationship or a traumatic childhood. So thank you so much for sharing this, Christina, because I know it's very personal, and you've had to make yourself very vulnerable, and I really appreciate it. And it brings kind of clarity to our role as a mom, and it primarily is to protect our children, and we have to put them above our partners.
Absolutely.
We do.
One thing I'll add, just to kind of end this on a happier note, is that on the other side of healing from this kind of abuse is the ability to heal yourself through your parenting. And what I mean by that is there are so many times in my life where, because I've chosen to react differently to certain things, my children don't have the same connection to stuff. And I get to watch them be in a healthy, stable, like safe, loving environment. One of those things is whenever my daughter, like I mentioned the dishwasher situation earlier, when my daughter spills something or makes a mess, she says, "Oops, I made a mess. Gotta tell a parent, gotta clean it up." And there's no level of fear. There's no scared vibes. There's no shaking or any sort of like indication that she would be in harm because she dropped something. And every time that happens, something in me becomes a little bit more healed. And there are so many things like that in parenting once you come on the other side of healing from this that you can see. And as you become a better parent for them, you get to watch like yourself heal from that and see that the good memories they're having, and watch them like flourish in an environment that you wish you had had. And so I just want to leave that with people who are maybe going through this healing process. Like on the other side of the work that you will do is this really wonderful full circle moment where you get to watch your children have healthy reactions to things and not have those same associations. And it really does, do something for your heart. For today's topic, we did talk about a lot of things that were sensitive. In our show notes, we will have some amazing resources. Please check those out. And if you would like to share your experience or takeaways from today's episode, feel free to privately message us or email us at momversationclub@gmail.com.
And that brings us to the end of another episode of the Momversation Club.
And if you've enjoyed today's show, which we hope you have, please don't forget to subscribe, like, and leave a review. Your support helps us reach even more moms and build a stronger village.
Thanks so much. Until next time. Bye.